Hi, Ozzy here. In a recent video, I discussed one of the limitations of reason, specifically the futility of trying to justify one's trust in reason using reason itself. I argued in that video that one just presupposes the reliability of reason and of one's cognitive capacities whenever one exercises one's reason to put forth any argument. And my aim was to discourage those who are talking to presuppositionalists from falling into the trap of thinking that there must be some way of defending reason and of one's cognitive capacities without presupposing the reliability of these. The presuppositionalist challenge that we supply a reason to defend reason without arguing in a circle is a preposterous and incoherent request. And I ended that video by stating that the presuppositionalist's own demand that one supply a rational argument for why one should trust in one's reason and cognitive capacities is a demand that no one can satisfy, including, I maintain, the presuppositionalists themselves. And in this video, I'm going to expound a little more on how I view reason and its connection to what are called properly basic beliefs, and to explain why unsupported, properly basic beliefs are not a license to believe in any old thing. And this is all with a view to showing why presuppositionalism, even with its theological presuppositions, can't establish the reliability of reason and our cognitive capacities without arguing in a circle. In short, I want to show why they can't meet their own challenge and why none of us have to act as if we're allergic to certain universally held assumptions known as properly basic beliefs. Now, before plunging into all of that, I want to address an objection I read in the comments to the last video I made on this subject. One commenter charged that I was guilty of committing the tu quoque fallacy. He alleged that I was saying, "We all defend reason by arguing in a circle, but you presuppositionalists do too." So I'm guilty, allegedly, of saying, "Oh yeah, well, you argue in a circle too." That's the tu quoque fallacy. You do it too. And I want to divest that objection. There's no tu quoque fallacy here, because I'm not suggesting for a moment that I can defend the use of reason using reason, not by circular reasoning or any other sort of reasoning. In fact, I'm pointing out that whoever would undertake that task is misapplying his reason. What's worse, you presuppositionalists are challenging us to do what I insist cannot be done, should not be attempted, namely demanding that we try to defend our trust in reason by the use of reason, knowing that any attempt to do so would be irrational. I don't try to do that. So you're projecting. I don't pretend that I can show the reliability of reason by reason. I leave that to presuppositionalists and naive people on either side of the theist-atheist divide who don't fully appreciate what's wrong with the circular argument, or who aren't familiar enough with these epistemological questions as to believe that there must be some non-circular ways of justifying induction and deduction and the like. Now, I wish I could brag that atheists don't fall prey to the same temptation of thinking that there's got to be some way to defend reason via reason. But sadly, it's a very widely shared mistake. I hear it from both sides. So there's no tu quoque fallacy happening here. I'm saying you presuppositionalists are arguing in a circle when you try to defend reason by what you think is a non-circular argument. And I'm saying that I have no argument of any kind to defend reason. Reason, as I said in that previous video, is like a ladder upon which we stand to reach other conclusions. You should not use reason to defend the reliability of reason, just as you should not climb a ladder in the hopes of reaching the ladder that you're standing on. Okay, so back to the actual point of this video. My view is this. We all just assume reason's reliability, without foundation, without justification, to support our knowledge claims, theist and atheist alike. Reason, broadly construed, is based on presuppositions, lots of them. And having presupposed a pile of things, we then employ reason to derive and elaborate and defend the rest of the beliefs that make up our web of belief, or the edifice of knowledge, if you prefer. Now, I'm going to list a few things, a partial list of things that we all take for granted, including you presuppositionalists. Okay, the first one. The existence of a mind-independent reality is a presupposition. That's the idea that there's a world out there, outside our minds, that the world isn't just some product of our imagination or our minds, that you aren't the only mind in existence, that there's an objective world out there. There's no way to establish that, no way to prove that, no evidence you can give that can show that it's not all happening in your mind. Any evidence that you could point to, any experience that you could mention, any experiment you carried out, any reasoning you did, could just be happening all in your mind. There's no way to prove that. The next presupposition. The validity-preserving character of logical deduction. Now, that's the assumption that the inference rules of formal reasoning or formal logic will yield true conclusions when they're applied to true premises and the inference rules are correctly applied. There's no way to defend that idea without using deduction itself. It would be circular reasoning. Next is the reliability of induction. Now, induction, that's the idea that one can make reliable but not exceptionless generalizations from specific cases based in our own experiences, because the future will continue to resemble the past in relevant respects. For instance, if all crows you've ever seen are black, well, then you infer that probably all or most crows are black. Now, there are many problems with induction, from Hempel's paradox to Nelson's new riddle of induction to Hume's famous justificatory problem of induction. The latter is the biggest problem. There's no way to defend induction without assuming the validity of induction. I'll leave it as an exercise to anyone who's curious about this to just look up Hume's problem of induction if they doubt me on this. Okay, next presupposition, causation. That's the idea that some events bring about other events. Everything from one billiard ball hitting another and causing it to move, to the conviction that one's visual experiences are caused by the objects that we happen to be looking at, to mental causation, when you sort of decide to raise your arm and your arm goes up. There are lots of different types of causation, and there are lots of difficulties with the concept of causation here. But the biggest problems involve the fact that we don't see causation. You have to infer causation, which means we have to assume both deduction and induction in the process. Next is the notion of truth and falsity. This is the idea that sentences and beliefs express propositions which can correspond or fail to correspond with states of affairs. Now, theories of truth are enormously technical, but just to give you a sense of the difficulty, ask yourself what it would mean to have an accurate definition of truth. An accurate definition of truth. What would it mean to say that one's proposed definition of truth was accurate or correct? Don't words like correct and accurate presume truth as a concept themselves? So one has to essentially be employing a concept of truth before one can even determine which theories of truth might be true. Next is the existence of other minds, sometimes called the other minds problem in philosophy. This is just the idea that the people we see out there in the world are not zombies. They have inner lives, just as you do. They have thoughts and feelings and sensations and perceptions and emotions. The difficulty here is that we don't have direct access to other people's subjective mental experiences. We have to infer those. We have to read those into a person's behavior. Just to highlight this, I think about pain. I'm aware of my pain in a way that you can't be aware of my pain. And I'm aware of your pain in a way that you aren't aware of it. You're aware of it very differently. I don't infer that I'm in pain. I have to infer that you're in pain. I don't infer that I'm hearing my wife's voice. I have to infer, if I can't hear your wife's voice when she's talking to you. We just have experiences. We don't infer them. But when it comes to experiences in other people, when it comes to other minds, we have to infer that. And thus we're assuming that their behaviors are explicable in terms of experiences which we don't have direct access to. We posit that others have a mental life. Does Commander Data on Star Trek actually feel anything? Well, he behaves as if he does, but if such an android existed, perhaps he wouldn't. We have no way of establishing that fact. And so it is with all other minds. We're forced to posit other minds. Nobody has ever had an experience of another mind. Next is the reliability of perception. This is the idea that your perceptual capacities, such as touch and sight and hearing, are generally reliable. We can only assume this, though, if we assume induction and causation and a mind-independent reality and all the rest of it. The reliability of memory is another one. Ask yourself, if you didn't trust your own memories, how would you ever corroborate that your memory was reliable? You wouldn't even be able to assume that what you think you remember even happened. There's no fact-checking, no hypothesis testing without memory. Another is the concept of a unified self or agent. This is the idea that you exist and exist as an agent. That is, you're a continuous being within which thoughts and experiences occur and who is the author of actions. You don't experience yourself as a discontinuous, unrelated set of experiences. You think of yourself as a unity. You have experiences. Experiences happen to you and in you. Okay. There's a lot more that could be said, a lot more examples of these sorts of things, but that's enough for now. Now, these are all universally held assumptions. These are presuppositions we all hold. We act on these every day of our lives. Seldom do we even think about these things, much less question them, which is why they seem self-evident. It seems crazy to question them, but none of them are self-evident. There are, in fact, many more such universally held assumptions, but I want to press on. Now, these universally held assumptions are properly basic beliefs. They're properly basic beliefs because, when taken together, they make up or constitute rationality and reasonableness. Assuming such things is just what we mean by the words reasonable and rational. Those are the assumptions which, if you violate or discard them, would make your own words, thoughts, and actions unintelligible. That's not true of all our beliefs. We can jettison many of our beliefs, but you can't jettison properly basic beliefs without abandoning nearly everything we call reason. They are the machinery of belief acquisition, belief revision, and rejection. A person who would deny these things, and I mean really deny them, in action, not merely just profess to deny them or mouth the words, such a person would not make any rational inferences, would not be able to learn from experience, would not recognize relevant causes where they exist, would be solipsistic, would treat others as zombies, would deny the very evidence of his own senses, would ignore his own memories, would not see himself as the author of his own actions. Such a person's rational incontinence and inexplicable behavior would move us to take action to safeguard him from himself. However, we have no means of establishing as fact these universally held assumptions that we all make, without implicitly assuming them in the very attempt at establishing their veracity. They're not self-evident. Just try to prove them without arguing in a circle. One can't even use some subset of these in conjunction with one another to support or establish the veracity and reliability of others in the list. I mean, some of them can be supported using some others. I sort of gave some examples of that earlier on, but not all of them. And the ones that do the supporting of others, well, they themselves are not supported by any others. There's no getting around the problem. And if you're tempted to some sort of naive pragmatism here, and you feel yourself wanting to scream out, well, these things all work for me. Well, yes, they work for you. They work for me too. And how exactly did you establish that they work for you? What did you utilize to come to that realization? Did you not trust your senses? Did you not rely on your memory? Did you not apply induction and deduction and presuppose the existence of causation and your own self as a locus for all of these experiences and a whole world full of stable and predictable uniformities that caused you to have such experiences? Of course you did. You can't get as far as concluding that anything works without presupposing everything I've just described. That sort of pragmatism is completely circular and question-begging. So don't go there. So this is the epistemic predicament in which we find ourselves. One might wish it were not so, but that's our circumstance. Intellectual honesty, intellectual integrity, and intellectual modesty means, among other things, not pretending to know or have answers to questions when we don't have them, even when the questions are as fundamental as this one. One just has to acknowledge one's epistemological limits, including the limits of what can be shown by reason. Pretending that we don't make the assumptions I named a moment ago, or grasping for facile and question-begging postulates, or just-so stories, or God-did-it stories, is no solution. One mustn't posit just any old thing in the hopes that it will get us out of a philosophical jam. We can't willfully posit or postulate a concept such as God or karma or a realm of Platonic forms and insist that it's real and this concept includes whatever unspecified properties would be needed to get us out of whatever philosophical problem we're struggling with, because those are just vacuous assertions. Doing that kind of thing is the sort of thing that gives philosophy a bad name. The philosopher Bertrand Russell spoke to this very point when he said, "The method of postulating what we want has many advantages. They are the same advantages of theft over honest toil." Another important point to appreciate here is that the mere fact that some beliefs in our belief set are properly basic is not a license to believe any old thing we'd like. The properly basic beliefs which constitute rationality and reasonableness are precisely what constrain what we may responsibly posit and postulate and ultimately accept as justified, even though those properly basic beliefs can't be pressed into service to justify themselves. Those properly basic beliefs aren't a carte blanche or a blank check or an excuse to have faith in anything you'd like. True, we accept these properly basic beliefs without justification, but fortunately, they constitute rationality, and as such, they function as brakes on unprincipled and wanton assumptions. They're the very things we must assume so as to be not assuming any old damn thing. For example, it's from such properly basic beliefs that we recognize the value of Occam's razor. It's often said that Occam's razor says, "The simpler theory is the better theory." That's not at all what it states. It states that one must not multiply explanatory entities beyond that which is strictly necessary to explain something. Explanations can be complicated, but only as complicated as they need to be to explain what needs explaining. Occam's razor, you see, is an application within everyday life and in science of a general principle of logic. And that principle is, if a premise in an argument is redundant, if it can be eliminated without affecting the conclusion, then the premise is pointless. It's a fifth wheel. Just get rid of it. So Occam's razor is the application of a properly basic belief. It's the utilization, it's the elaboration of a properly basic belief, specifically the properly basic belief in the reliability of deduction. And it serves to prevent us from positing any old damn thing whenever we want to explain something. You can't invoke any old thing. Properly basic beliefs don't just make it possible then to arrive at conclusions. They make it possible to call bullshit on some postulates or hypothetical explanations. And while we're on the subject of hypothetical explanations, it's worth stressing that, again, you can't posit any old thing to explain something unless it actually does explain something. Only if it genuinely explains something do you have some reason to think it might exist. And even then, you still want to show that it does exist, to show that your hypothetical explanation is more than merely hypothetical, that it's likely to be the correct explanation. After all, we can imagine things which, if they existed, would explain all sorts of things. For instance, Superman's amazing strength, invulnerability, his speed, his ability to fly, and his time-traveling abilities could explain how the Grand Canyon came to exist. You see, he carved it out a long time ago to get some exercise and to create a very lovely view for himself. Now, that doesn't make Superman a good explanation for the Grand Canyon. But I suppose one could also argue, but he carved out many such natural wonders all over the globe in order to maintain his impressive-looking musculature, and so he'd always have nice views to enjoy while zipping around on the Earth. It explains so much. Still not impressed. Well, someone might come back, but don't you see how it explains all these magnificent terrestrial monuments we thought were natural? And we can explain why we find no direct evidence of his having done so, because he didn't want to call attention to his existence and his time-traveling abilities. And we don't see Superman much because, he spends so much time in his fortress of solitude. Don't you see how internally consistent this all is? There's no good reason to think Superman exists. The fact that Superman, if he existed, could explain a lot doesn't mean Superman is the rational explanation we need to adopt given the state of the evidence that we do have. And the reason I reject Superman as an explanation for the Grand Canyon isn't that I have some philosophical prejudice or that I'm committed to the impossibility of aliens from another world that might have vastly different natures from our own. No. The problem is that it's a pseudo-explanation. At best, it's a placeholder for a natural explanation. Even if we seriously entertained Superman as an explanatory entity, we wouldn't understand how he created the Grand Canyon, why he actually did it, or why he has the nature he has, which gives him his specific attributes or superpowers under our yellow sun. Anything we say about Superman's nature is just stipulation, whether it's about his powers, his nature, his motivations. It's just stipulation, not discovery. To accept the Superman theory of Grand Canyon formation is to ignore a huge chunk of the other properly basic beliefs which constitute rationality and thus constrain us from accepting pseudo-explanations. The Superman theory of Grand Canyon formation stipulates much about Superman's powers and motives, but somehow induction and reliance on our senses and looking for causes has all been neglected in this account. The fact that the Superman theory would explain a lot of things and that it's internally consistent is just not enough. Now, why do I mention all this? Well, it's because presuppositionalists place a very high value on internal consistency, specifically the alleged internal consistency of their so-called Christian worldview. Now, there's much one could challenge about this alleged internal consistency of their worldview, or even the claim that Christianity is a worldview, but that's an argument for another day. My point here is that if we've learned anything in the long history of Western philosophy, it's that one can make an idol of internal consistency. The methods of scientific inquiry are the slowly recognized implications and outworkings of the properly basic beliefs I mentioned at the outset. Most especially the beliefs that there's a mind-independent reality and a reliance on perception, the concept of causation, the reliability of inductive reasoning, but really all of them. The scientific method has driven home to us the relative value of intersubjective agreement, evidence gathering, and hypothesis testing over mere internal consistency. We have plenty of scientific theories for which we have some outstanding evidence. And yet we also know that some of our best supported theories, such as quantum mechanics and relativity, are, strictly speaking, incompatible. They can't both be correct, not as they stand at present. But we have evidence to think that they're both true. Shall we, because we recognize an internal inconsistency within our scientific and physical picture of reality, abandon one of them, or both of them? No. No, because consistency is not a measure of truth. Inconsistency is a mark of error. That's right. The truth does have to be composed of consistent statements, yes. But it doesn't follow from this that every set of internally consistent statements is true. And inconsistency just means something, somewhere in our belief set, has got to give. We don't just start abandoning chunks of what we have reason to think is true just because we recognize that something somewhere has to give. Much less do we jettison our whole worldview in favor of a set of dubious posits for which evidence is lacking. The pragmatic considerations, which determine when to revise a theory or abandon it, are quite complicated. There's a whole branch of philosophy of science that deals with such questions. But the point here is that mere inconsistencies or the existence of unanswered questions, philosophical or otherwise, by themselves aren't enough to just abandon a worldview. We hold on to our provisional truth claims so long as we have evidence to think they're true, and as long as the way forward looks promising, despite the presence of inconsistencies within our picture of reality. If we rejected our theories as soon as we discovered an internal inconsistency or an anomaly, we'd never get anywhere. And even if someone comes along with a beautifully coherent and internally consistent metaphysical picture of reality, we shouldn't run to it because there could be more than one such internally consistent picture of reality. Consistency in a logical or formal argument is necessary if the argument is to be valid. But validity is just validity. It's not soundness. It's not truth. For an argument to be a proof, it has to be both formally valid, that is, the inference rules of logic must be correctly applied, and it has to be sound, that is, the premises must be true. If you want certainty, you need validity of the argument, validity of inference rules, and sound premises. Now, if you're the sort of person who obsesses and fetishizes certainty the way some presuppositionalists do, you should be valuing soundness every bit as much as validity or internal consistency. An argument that is merely valid, merely self-consistent, but doesn't have sound premises can yield false conclusions. Now, if you don't believe me, look up validity versus soundness. Validity is not truth, much less is consistency truth. Now, consistency in a worldview or a belief set is therefore merely desirable. It's a desideratum, as they say. Making internal consistency a requirement of one's overall worldview is making a mere epistemic ideal into the enemy of hard-won knowledge. What's preferable is to have a belief set consisting of uncertain, provisionally held theories, while fully acknowledging where the inconsistencies reside and the existence of important, even fundamental questions which remain unanswered, but for which we nevertheless have good reasons for the provisional answers we have arrived at. Now, to understand any of this is to understand and recognize how our properly basic beliefs, which undergird our scientific methods and scientific values, constrain what we can put forth as genuine explanations, and inform what our epistemic priorities are and should be. All right, now I'd like to switch gears and consider how the two main presuppositions of presuppositional apologetics are themselves dependent on other presuppositions, the properly basic beliefs I named earlier. Now, the two main presuppositions of presuppositional apologetics are that, first, the Christian God exists, and second, that the Bible is revealed knowledge from that God. Now, you presuppositionalists couldn't infer anything from the existence of your hypothetical God, or even learn about such a God, or even conceive of such a God, without tacitly employing the universally held properly basic beliefs I've been talking about. You can't reason or think about your God, contemplate his attributes, apprehend his nature, or correlate your concept of God with the words said about him in your sacred texts without exercising your reason. And with respect to the idea that Scripture is divinely revealed truth, you can't get as far as reading your Bibles without assuming that there's a mind-independent reality. You must first assume that the Bible, like your God, is out there, part of a mind-independent reality and not merely a figment of your own solipsistic imagination. You also assume it was written, that the Bible, that is, you also assume the Bible was written by other minds and inspired by a mind, a supernatural mind at that. You're presupposing other minds exist. You assume, when you read it, that your sensory perceptual apparatus is reliable, that the visual experiences you're having as you gaze at the page are veridical and correspond to what's actually printed on the page, not illusory and not dreams or hallucinations. You're assuming the reliability of your senses, and you're employing the concept of truth. You assume, in the very act of reading the Bible, that your memory is functioning, so that you can trust that you correctly recall the start of the sentence by the time you get to the end of it. You assume your inferential procedures, such as deductive and inductive reasoning, are reliable means of arriving at true conclusions whenever you make inferences about the meanings of the verses in your sacred texts, such as when you compare one verse with another to see what they imply, when you deem two verses to be agreeing with one another, or whether one verse makes the same point as another, or whether you assess it makes a different point, or whether it's merely elaborating on another point, and so forth. And when it comes to this allegedly self-authenticating inner testimony of the Holy Spirit operating within you, that subjective experience you think is so incommunicable and comes from another mind, well, you're assuming another mind, you're assuming you exist, and that you're an agent with a mind that's having that experience. And further, that this experience isn't just some purely first-person subjective mental state, but that it actually points or refers beyond the mere mental state itself to some other entity than your own mental state and yourself, and that this other agent is bringing about or causing something to happen in you or to you. For that matter, causation is being assumed by you the moment you decide to read the Bible with the intention of opening it up to look at its contents. You couldn't act without presupposing you exist and have a mind and are an agent who can act causally in the real world. In short, you can't get as far as presupposing the two things you say are needed to make sense of the world, the Christian God and the veracity of Scripture as revealed divine knowledge, those two things, without first presupposing all of the things I listed above. Your presuppositions are not basic. You're failing to acknowledge the actual presuppositions behind what you think are your most basic presuppositions. You're just stapling on two other assumptions into the list of universally held, properly basic beliefs in order to get to your theological dogmas. What you are calling your presuppositions are just theological dogmas re-described as assumptions or presuppositions to help you get to the rest of your theological dogmas. They're what you need to assume without foundation to launch you from our workaday worldview to your specifically Christian beliefs, such as the idea of a fall in the Garden of Eden, original sin, a God who demands atonement, heaven and hell, the massacre of a man as an atoning human sacrifice, and so on. So, you've been helping yourself to the whole set of unjustified but properly basic beliefs we all employ, which together constitute rationality and reasonableness, and from which we've elaborated an impressive and hard-won body of knowledge. And you're denying that you've helped yourself to these, while trying to pretend that you can defend these using your theological assumptions. What's worse, you declare that the dogmas you need to support your theological claims are all any of us need to answer some age-old philosophical questions. Well, some of us would rather not pretend to have a complete, consistent worldview. We'd rather have an incomplete, inconsistent, uncertain belief set made up of provisionally held beliefs, which are properly motivated and honestly recognize our epistemological limits. Because unlike some people, we aren't intellectually satisfied with pseudo-explanations and vacuous accounts. Your presuppositions aren't presuppositions. They're your dogmas. The dogmas you need to support the rest of your theology. And they're piggybacking on our properly basic beliefs. Okay, I hope this helps a bit, and thank you for watching.